Subtropical Gardening Podcast with Paul Plant.
It's time for another Subtropical Gardening podcast. And because the weather has changed, we've gone from the cool winter. We're now in the warmer spring period here in southeast Queensland in the subtropics of Australia. It's time to be aware that this is our dry season. So this podcast is all about water-wise gardening and trying to get your head around what are the things that we need to be aware of to optimize our gardening and to create the perfect garden. During this podcast, I'll be talking about the myths, the truths of, what we hear and what really is true. The secret to any water efficient garden is generally the soil, but I'll get into that in far more details. Some hints about garden design, also some lawn, and also the productive garden. Yes, you can create and produce a productive garden for both fruit and veggies if you choose the right plants. And of course, the ornamental and the native plants will be addressed to make sure that you achieve the optimum perfect garden considering water-wise strategies. Now, before we get stuck into it, if you enjoy this video and the podcast, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. In that way, you can be kept up to date whenever a video comes available, when a podcast becomes available. And also you can join in the comments because I'd love to hear from you and your suggestions, because you could suggest some new ideas, new practices that other gardeners may be aware of, and that they can share those tips, those things that you do, which are really helpful for some other gardeners. So let's get stuck straight into it. So first up, of course, this is water-wise gardening. We're going to be talking about some of these strategies. And let's just tackle these myths and the truths to do with each one of these. Now, the myth I remember during one of the last drought periods we had is only grow cacti and succulents. Sorry, folks. There is a huge range of plants we can grow to achieve a beautiful, productive garden in a dry situation, in a dry period, if you are water conscious. It's all about selecting the right plants, but the range of plants is enormous. Another myth. Water-wise gardens are drab, boring, and dull and lack color. Again, a water-wise garden can be full of flowers, textured leaves, colored leaves, full of flowers, full of food crops. Yes, you can create a productive cropping if you choose the right plants for flowers, for foliage, for veggies, for fruit production, for root production. It's all about understanding the climate and the conditions and those particular plants. I also remember being told by so many government authorities in a water-wise garden, only plant Australian natives. Well, the truth is natives and non-natives do really well in a water-wise garden. And also some natives are just simply not suitable for a dry garden. They will die because they're from a drier climate. So again, the plant selection is critical. Another myth I've heard is a low water-wise garden, I should say a good water-wise garden, but a low water usage garden will have a lack of wildlife. Again, it's a myth. The number of wildlife that will come to your garden, if it is thriving, if it is abundant with flowers and foliage and leaves, they will come to your yard because it's the habitat. It is the food for them. Because they can't find it out in the wild, they'll come to your garden. So you can create the habitat, the oasis in the middle of a desert for the wildlife to come and visit your garden. And of course, another myth, you can only grow during drought periods, you can only grow water-wise plants. Well, no. If you wish to be water conservative, for example, if you're on rain tanks and you don't want to use too much water in the garden, why not delve into a water-wise garden? Select plants that are more suitable for your soil and your climate so that you do not use too much water. I'm hoping Those little myths, I've just busted them so that you can understand the opportunity that is now available to you. Now, what is the secret of a water-wise, efficient garden? I've broken it into 3 different groups: soil, nature, and culture. Let's tackle soil first. Now, your soil type can play a very important impact on how water dependent your garden can be and how dependent those plants can be. And structure is also important. So soil type, we tend to describe this as clay, sandy, or silty. Structure, we tend to describe this as blocky or prismatic or with no structure. So to give you an idea, clay soils will hold more water for longer, whereas sandy soils will drain quicker. You'll need more water on a sandy soil than you will for a clay soil. If you have a structure of a soil that has good structure, like a block or a clog, they will hold water and allow drainage through. Whereas if you have a soil that has no structure, such as pure sand, the water is unimpededly drained out through. It has no capacity for the plants to access the moisture because the water has just penetrated all the way down and percolated down to the lower levels. So we want a soil that this type holds moisture. We want a structure so it develops stronger root systems and that the water can be caught within the different structure forms of a soil. And of course, topography. If you're on the top of the hill, the water will drain away. If you're on the lower parts of the hill, you will get more water from those up the hill, but you'll also get their topsoil. So your soil tends to be a little bit deeper, more of an alluvial type if you're lucky, so your soil naturally will hold moisture for a lot longer. Now, when it comes to nature, there's a couple of things to consider. You've got the species. Some plants are better suited to dry areas than others. And one thing you can do here is to investigate the species to see what its natural distribution is and whether or not it's from a dry area, and select those plants for your garden. The season is also very important because here in the subtropics, we have a wet summer and autumn and typically a drier winter and spring. And recognizing those variables will help you eliminate any stress you may have, because if you see a plant starting to lose its leaves in spring, here in the subtropics, that might be natural for that species in this area. And we can choose plants that grow better during the wet season, during the rainy season, so we don't have to keep watering them. And I know some of my plants during the dry season, they go deciduous, they go dormant. So there's no need to worry about them. I just leave them alone, don't touch them. I let them go through their natural, necessary dormancy period. And then when the weather warms up and the rains start to appear, that's when I see the starting of growth, and that's when I start to increase the irrigation. Part of this nature strip I've got of information is also temperature. So as the temperatures rise, most plants will be much more active in growth, and of course the increase of water may be needed. As the temperature decreases towards winter, the processes within the plant reduce, and therefore the demand of water tends to also decrease. So that will help you save water. Rainfall is important, and you'll see that little bar graph if you're watching this podcast in the video. In most areas, you will see councils put up the fire risk danger, and that's really, really important. So when it goes up into the reds, the danger zones, you know that there's low humidity, there's not much rainfall, there's a lot of fire tinder in the undergrowth of the bushland, and we have to be extra careful with fires. So think about rainfall and humidity as a combination in relation to your season and the temperature. So it's all part of nature, and that will help you select better plants and, more importantly, understand your local climate and weather conditions. My third column of information I'd like to talk about is our cultural practices. In a water efficient garden, we want to make sure we compost. We want to make sure we create humus as a result of the composting process. So we're adding organic matter into our compost bin, the leaf litter that we find in our bushland area, and also when we do pruning and we drop it to the ground, that's the chop and drop method, that will break down slowly through the composting process and add humus to the soil. Now, if we are composting, we can of course just add that layer to the top of the soil, and that's basically mulch. And you can buy mulch in leaves that come off the gum trees and all the other trees. That forms a mulch layer, and that helps protect the soil and keeps moisture within the soil layer. Now, I'm a strong advocate of mulch being around about 10 centimeters deep when you lay it, because it will compress and decompose over time down to about that 5 centimeter height. And that's kind of the long-term ideal depth for your mulch layer. But applying it, I always go for apply 10 centimeters deep, because it will break down. And part of that is that the mulching and the composting increases your microflora, your microbes in the soil, and that kind of improves the overall health of your soil environment and also the health of the plants. And if you are looking at the video, I've got microclimate in the culture section. That should be over in the middle section under nature, and I should have written that as microorganisms. So a bit of an apology from me. Then my next point, of course, is irrigation. If you want your plants to succeed during a dry period, you can consider irrigation. Drip irrigation is a method the nursery industry and the landscape industry use because it conserves water. It doesn't spread water over the foliage, and it tends to put water exactly where it needs, which is to the root zone. So you're not increasing evaporation, which is the wastage of the water during a dry period. You're putting it efficiently where it needs, in the root zone where the plants are. And another point is shade. If you can increase the shade within your yard, it's going to be cooler for you. It'll be cooler for the plants. They will not transpire as much, which means their demand for water is less. So there's some really key things to remember with those. So the priorities, the summary of those is simply put, what you want to do is to make sure that you've got the mulch, you've got the compost, you do a little bit of irrigation, you choose the right situation, you choose species that are suitable for your climate, you fix your soil up. These are all key points that are really important for a successful garden. I'll highlight them again in the podcast if you're watching it on the video. So they are the compost, mulching or humus, creating that humus. So compost, mulch, and humus are combined, choosing the right species, creating the microclimate by planting plants together, which will also increase, with those top three, some of the microorganisms in the soil, watering, whether you do irrigation through drip irrigation, which I highly recommend, or spraying all the foliage. Just on that point, just remember our tropical plants are from a more humid climate, so they do appreciate a bit of a misting, a spray over the foliage periodically. And if you try to mimic what happens in nature, which is the long day and then the rainfall in the afternoon, so I tend to do when I get home, I get the sprinkler on or a hand hose, and I hose down my tropical plants in the afternoon, predominantly just over the foliage. If the plants are wilting, I'll give them a really good water to the root system and to the pots, but the tropical plants do appreciate a bit of wet foliage to mimic the tropical rainfalls, those afternoon storms during the summer months. So remember that little one point. Now for rain tanks, this is really, really important if you're on rain tanks. Now, how much is enough rainwater? Listen, I've seen many home gardens have, rain tanks of just, just 5,000 liters or things like that. But I really want to recommend people, if you're serious about rain tanks, what you want is approximately, 5,000 is the minimum. I'd be going for 15,000, 20,000, 25,000. It depends how serious you are with gardening and the larger your garden is. So think about a situation. Now, I know this is how nurseries work it and landscapers work it. They work out exactly how much every sprinkler puts out for the duration. They work that out over the week and over the month. And they imagine, okay, for a 1 month period, if no rain happens, how much water do I need? And that's how most businesses set up their tanks to plan ahead for a dry period. So for home, we have a dry period here in the subtropics from late winter through spring to early summer. That's 3 months. How much water do you use in your garden? 5,000 litres may not be enough. 20,000, I think, is ideal. Now, I've got to say, my house relies upon rain tanks. So I have quite a fair few tanks for the house, but also for the garden as well. So think about the volume of water you may need for your garden. And if you're growing fruit and veggies, you will need more water compared to if you were just growing Australian natives, which are local to your area. So the type of species, your type of soil, as I mentioned, will also have a huge impact on the amount of water you need to be self-sufficient without having to use tap water or municipal council water. Now, moving on from those, designing a water efficient garden. What are the steps? Well, one of those is clumping the plants together so that you put similar plants that require the same amount of water in the same area. It's also one of the principles of permaculture, putting certain plants closer to the house so you can maintain them quicker, more easily, and watch them to look after them for pest diseases and watering. But for garden design, we tend to group plants according to water usage. So succulent strips or raised areas, which we use more of the drier loving plants, we tend to put the similar style plants together. In a more shady area, we might want more shade-loving, water-loving plants, and therefore we would group those together to simplify maintenance, but also the watering needs. Also be aware of where slope happens in your property, because if you can, capture that water, whether it's through drainage systems, whether it's through swales. What we want to do is, if you are on a slope, capture it and slow the water down so that it permeates into your soil profile, so that it is part of your reservoir and not the neighbors down the hill, or even worse, into the storm drains and then out into the ocean. So if you can, wherever possible, try to conserve the water on your own property so that you don't have to use more water at a later point. Another option to create a water efficient garden is build rain gardens, also known as wicking beds. I'll talk about that very soon. I talked about the rain tanks just then. The bigger, the better. I'm sorry, folks, little tiny rain tanks might be fine for a week, maybe 2 if you've got a few pot plants, but they really won't do you justice if you're thinking about multiple weeks, even months. And I encourage people to go for 20,000 litres if you have the space. That's the big question. And it's a problem when we have small block development, which the councils approve. Big houses are put on those blocks and there's not much space left for water tanks. My recommendation is, if you can organise this, and I do know of a number of builders who have done this, they actually work with the engineers in the early stages and put the rain tanks under the driveways. It is an option. It is available to people. And lawns. Oh my goodness, lawns. I encourage everyone, do not be a lawn perfectionist. Deep watering is very important, not a light sprinkle. The cultivar selection is important. And please be aware that if you allow mixed species through your lawn, it will allow you to have a green lawn that at some times of the year, one variety may not look too good, but the other variety will still survive and thrive. And then when the wet weather comes, the other variety will come back, and the first variety might look not as good, but it will balance out and still provide you with a wonderful green lawn that you and your kids can use. So please think about mixing your lawn species to make it much more water efficient. Now, rain gardens, or rain beds, or wicking beds as they are known. Now, this is a very simple example. Get my fingers right. On the screen, if you are watching it as a podcast, I've got an image of a typical wicking bed where in one area water goes. It could be through a hose pipe, or it could be the downpipe of your gutter system. And that forms a reservoir at the base. So there's like a piping system at the base, which is then covered in stone, which has a film on top of that, to which the potting mix or the soil mix goes on top of that. And then the plants go within that soil media. There tends to be a little bit of an air vent pipe as well, just to prevent any air vacuuming in the system. And of course, there must be an overflow valve, because otherwise the whole thing fills up and it becomes a mud pile. And I've seen so many wicking beds created without the drainage pipe. So please remember the overflow pipe. Now, to explain that a little bit closer, here's some examples. I've put an image for those of you watching the video version of this podcast. Now, that's the stage one: a bucket, a container with the downpipe and a horizontal pipe, very simply made with PVC piping you can get from the hardware store. And the horizontal piping has perforated holes in it to allow drainage and the water to escape out. Over that are all the pebbles, the stones, to make sure it covers the pipe at the base. Geofabric or some film is then placed over that. I've known people used hessian bags, but they do break down too fast. If you can invest in geofabric, that will be better and it will last a lot longer. The geofabric also will not allow the potting media, the mix, the soil mix that you're using, to fall down into the stones, which will then block up the entire system. So be aware of that. I did notice here on this example, the drainage pipe wasn't put in at these early stages. It was put in at a later point. As you can see just there at the bottom of the screen, the potting mix is in there as well, and that's it virtually completed. So excess water can escape out, so it doesn't become a boggy environment where the roots rot and fungal pathogens can thrive. We do not want pathogens to thrive. We want the plants to thrive, so that drainage hole is very, very important. Now, let's get stuck into some of the plants to use and some of the plants to select when it comes to a water-wise garden. And we'll start off with the productive garden. And I've started off with the finger limes because I think it's a greatly underrated plant, both as an ornamental and a productive, and it ticks the box because it's a native environmental plant which can also help the habitat for bird life and butterflies. So finger limes. We've also got grapes, which is known as a very, very good water-wise plants because they will go deciduous and they do like a drier environment, pretty much like olives, but olives tend not to be very productive in the subtropical climate. If you choose the right variety of grapes, you will have productive grapes. And I know when I used to live in Nathan, my neighbor was a complete grape fanatic. So the fence between him and I was grapes. It was wonderful, absolutely fantastic. Sage and some of the other herbs, if you choose a number of the herbs which come from a more Mediterranean climate, they tend to survive a dry period far better and tend to be better water-wise plants. Just remember, however, when the wet season comes, they could actually die off if it's too humid and if you don't have good enough drainage. So with sage, grow it through the winter and spring period, but if it dies in summer, don't cry, just do it again next winter. Then of course, productive, listen, I cannot say enough about the pineapples. They are tough, they are resilient, they are really good. And as the pineapple swells, it stores a lot of the moisture it's capturing during the wet season in the fruit, so you get this beautiful fruit. So that's that image, that is a very young pineapple still growing and developing its flowers, and it's therefore baby fruit. Now for the ornamental garden beds, I'm going to start off with bromeliads. These plants basically look after themselves. You don't have to do anything. There are some for shade, some for sun. Again, choose the right varieties. I plant a lot at my property. This example is part of my walkway from the house to one of the rain tanks, and it's under the canopy of trees, which is very high canopy gum trees. So it gets no water from me, pure only irrigation from the rainfall, and they are thriving. But I think it's a combination of the light dappled situation they have under the gum trees. And my rainfall area where I live, it's pretty good. I'm in what I believe a high rainfall area here in southeast Queensland. But again, right now in my place, the grass is brown because I don't water my lawn and it looks dead, but it is technically alive. Other plants, here is two natives which are endemic to the areas. The first one, if you're looking at it, is Plectranthus, known as cockspurs. These are now called coleuses. These are soft foliage herbaceous plants with beautiful blue spire flowers, wonderful for the native bees. But this is a tough plant. They're indestructible. You don't have to fertilize it. You do not have to water it. It will look after itself. The other plant I've got on the image is what's called the love flower, Pseudoanthinum variable. It's a small little ground cover-like plant, prolific grower. It produces a lot of seeds, so it pops up everywhere, and I'm quite happy with that. This is the native one on my property, and it's the host again for butterflies. So it's pretty, it flowers, it's easy to grow. I don't do anything to it, but incredibly water efficient. It's native and it's highly ornamental. Then, of course, you've got goodonias and grevilleas. There's a huge range of native plants available to you. And I've only put two on that image just to show you some of the ranges available. On this slide, if you're watching, I've got cacti, euphorbias, and succulents, and I've got dracaenas, which are incredibly tough. Now, these plants come from a range of different countries, and they are reliable, tough, hardy plants. They're lush, they look hardy, they're incredibly resilient. If you go to your local garden centre and ask for low maintenance plants, you'll often find these are what is suggested to you by the nursery staff. So good plants, I recommend them too. Although my head's in the way, frangipanis tend to be really good. They are deciduous in winter and spring, and then they put on their foliage and flowers in late spring into summer and through to autumn. So that's a good option because they are deciduous at the driest time of the year, which makes them perfectly adaptable to the situation. On the slide, I've also got storm lilies, Zephyranthes, Candida, which I think has now been reclassified as a Hybranthes, but I'm not too sure. Again, these things are dormant for most of the year. They look just like a grassy plant, and then when the wet season comes along, the flowers pop out. A good plant. It's resilient, it's tough, it's adapted to a drier garden, and it'll just sit there. It's got an underground bulb. It'll just sit there until the rain comes, and then it'll show off its pretty flowers. A good plant to use. Oop, I left it in the slide, and then I've added the dietes. Now I love dietes because they're tough, they're resilient. Councils use them, developers use them because they can plant them and then not worry about them. They will flower every single year. They are tough. And I do think part of the reason for this is both that Zephyranthes and the dietes, known as wild iris, are from similar climates, but from Africa. And they too have those wet season and then a dry season, just like us here in the subtropics. We can then talk and look at the combinations of individual plants to create garden inspiration. And when traveling and when you go to garden shows, look at how plants are used, what's used, and what's actually working. Now, if you are watching this video, the podcast, in the front there are crassula ovatas. At the back, mid-ground, there are aloes in flower. Then there are different types of plants. There are liriopes in the background. There's a grass tree in the background. There is, I think that's the native salt bush with the grey foliage, or it could even be a Westringia. The combinations of plants, if you watch garden shows, try to look at where the location is and see if those plants are suitable for your garden. I am concerned with people watching garden shows and even getting images from Pinterest and social media, because quite often that advice is not relevant to my particular climate. So you do need to be very selective in how you pluck the information from what you actually see. This is another simple combination. You've got a couple of succulents there. On the right-hand side, that's kalanchoas, and then on the left are some more crassulas. There's, believe it or not, pelargoniums and geraniums can be incredibly tough and resilient. And that's one of the old-fashioned, I think it's a regal type because of the zone pattern in there. Sorry, zonal pelargoniums. That's one of the toughest ones around. I've seen it in the driest parts of Ipswich, in neglected gardens, thriving, except it tends to not do too well in the more high rainfall areas, say Yamundi and some of those other zones. So choose your plants wisely. And the combinations of the silver on that image and the greens and the yellow, the lime green, I think is a beautiful combination. And then separated with the kind of pinky coral flowers of the geranium or the pelargonium make a really nice combination. Inquisitive, quirky, and yet quite interesting. Then, of course, you've got inspiration when you head to the Botanic Gardens. So this was up at Townsville. You've got the Bismarck here, the majestic Bismarck palms with a beautiful silver foliage with Castle Hill in the background. You know, you can get so much inspiration by visiting botanic gardens and private gardens, and definitely that is something I encourage you to do. And of course, bougainvilleas, known for their resilience and toughness. The trick with bougainvilleas obviously is to water them in to get them established. If you can do that through that spring period, and then once the wet season of summer comes, they're virtually taking care of themselves. You just might need to give them a little bit of a prune to maximize the flowers. And of course, they do love fertilizer. More garden inspiration is in the bush. Head to your native local forests or take a venture and look for the combinations of the plants that you see. So macrozamias and native cycads are beautiful, stately specimens that do not need additional water once planted. Now, these specimens on the image, if you can see them, are probably a couple of 100 years old. You may not have the time for that, but you can get an idea of the combination and inspiration on how plants should look if you wish to reflect and mimic what occurs in nature. And here's a good example of a tight garden using non-natives in this particular garden bed. And I think there were a few natives in there as well, which is the Myoporium ellipticans. You've got agaves, a great plant. You've got sansevierias, mother-in-law's tongue. And I know some people will claim them as weeds. And in some situations, yes, I agree, they are weeds. But in a contained area, for example, on the 31st floor of a high-rise building in a planter box, I think they are perfectly suitable. This image also has some cycads in the background, and I think there was also some crassulas in the background as well. So think of the situation. If you're in a high-rise building or an apartment where you're surrounded by concrete and reflective walls, you've got a whole lot of reflective heat. It's called the urban sink situation. You have to choose plants that are tough, and quite often you need to resort to desert-like species plants, which is why some of these are specimens from Africa and some from Australia as well. It's all about choosing the right plant for the right situation. That's the end of my slides. However, I do have more to talk about. Let me just bring up my little notes. So some of the key things is a water-wise productive garden, whether it's for veggies or fruit, is to prepare your garden beds for the production. So it could be adding the organic matter into the soil because that will hold moisture in your soil, making sure it's well mulched is critical. Um, Try not to use too much nitrogen in your soil, because what ends up happening is your plants put on a lot of foliage growth. The demand for water is incredibly high. So be very careful with your nitrogen application, please. Also, plan your planting in relation to the seasons. If you know the dry season is coming, or look ahead on the Bureau of Meteorology maps, and if you see there's no rain coming for the next 2 weeks, don't plant your seedlings. Don't plant your seed. Just wait. Do not worry about the moons. Do not worry about what the seed packet says. You have to plant it in October. If there is no rain in October, do not plant. Save the water and just delay it for a month later. If that means choosing a different variety or a different type of a vegetable to grow, so be it. Otherwise, use the water to help those plants germinate. You just might go through a little bit more water during that process. Another thing is wind. If you can, provide a bit of shelter or protection around the outside of your veggie patch. It could be constructing a fence or a barrier, because if you can reduce the wind going through your veggie patch, it reduces the evaporation from the plants, which means you don't use as much water. Now, that's one of the weird contradictory things, because if you do stop air movement, you can increase certain fungal problems in a humid environment. So working out a balance is something that you need to do when you garden. And as a gardener, you know, you have challenges. You have to work the compromise and figure out what works best for you. And if it's a productive garden, what you need to do to achieve the fruit veggies that you are actually after. And another is grow fruit and veggies that are suitable for your climate, for your soil. In other words, in my climate, the recommendation is look more towards the Asian and South American and Polynesian vegetables, which tend to work better compared to Mediterranean veggies and herbs. That way you find plants that grow more prolifically and are a lot easier and can handle the wet summer and be productive. So some of the ones that I recommend are Abica, Becella, which is also known as Ceylon spinach from memory, or have I got that around the wrong way? Hope that's right. No, Ceylon is different. That's Talinia, I think. Um, Cassava is a really good one, which means taro is also a really good one. You've got chaya, horseradish tree, which is also known as miracle leaf, which is um, a mental blank. I'll think about it. It'll come to my head in a minute. Jacamba, Okinawa spinach, sweet leaf, and yakon are also some more to think about growing. And sweet leaf is quite impressive. It's a small bushy plant. It can grow quite large, but you can prune it down to a small hedge. And I think that's a really good multifunctional, multi-use plant. You can use both as an ornamental plant and a productive leaf vegetable. And on that, I'll also mention things like Japoticaba as a fruiting plant, which is also really good as a hedge. So think about those combinations. You've also, as part of a water-wise garden, you always need to think about creating shady areas which will cool the garden down. So why not think of making some arbors and put things like beans or peas or yams or your passion fruit over those, so that you create patches of shade which will cool the soil down. As I mentioned, the soil is critical. You need to make sure that it's got everything that you need in there. I do encourage home gardeners to look for not just cow manure, which I think is one of the best, but think about adding the different types of manures in from various animals, because each animal eats a different diet, which means each of those plants had a different nutritional value, which can be added to your soil. That said, horse poo will increase the number of weeds in your yard, because they don't have the multiple stomach system of a cow, which does break down virtually all the weeds. Not all, but most of the weeds. Add seaweed solution, fish emulsion, fulvic acid. are really good things to add to your organic soil to improve its water holding ability and its nutrient value for the long term. I mentioned humus. You can buy humic acid. That's another way to increase and enhance the humus within your soil. Please stimulate the earthworms. They are the canaries for your garden. So, you know about the saying, canaries in a mine? Well, the earthworms, the more earthworms you have, the healthier your soil is. And to increase the earthworms, you need to increase the organic matter because that will feed the protozoa and the microbes, which is what the earthworm eats. So it all goes back to compost, it all goes back to mulching, it all goes back to humus. So make sure those key things are being added to your soil to increase the earthworm population. And fertility. I'm going to leave it up with you if you wish to go to manufactured synthetic products, or if you want to go to the organic, natural, chemical products. So natural, organic chemicals are rock minerals. Everything else, yeah, so everything's a chemical. Whether it's organic or inorganic, it's still a chemical. So remember the objective with all fruit and veggies is to obtain what's called nutrient-dense food for us to eat. So think about your soil. Think about the nutrients you add. Think about watering at the right time so that they are flowering and fruiting and filling up at the best potential time. What we add into the soil is what we eat. And think about that also for wildlife. You know, if you look after your plants, your native plants, they hopefully will be producing more richer nutrients and pollen for the bees, the butterflies, for the birds and everything else. So think about the overall health of your garden during cultivation period of the year so that during the dry period, the plants will be healthier to sustain through that dry period. What else should I mention? I mentioned a couple of tropical plants and I showed you those. Native plants, I've showed you those. Pot culture, probably one of the important things with pot culture during a dry period is to look for Australian standards on the potting mix. And what that means is that the potting mix has met certain criteria to sustain the plant for a certain amount of lifespan. Now, what it doesn't mean is how long the nutrients will stay in there forever. So there is an amount of nutrient in there which normally will be 3 months or 6 months. And usually the packet will say how long that nutrient is in there. A potting mix will not last forever. It needs to be replenished or even replaced. But normally what we do is we pot the plant up into a larger pot or into the ground. So hopefully by the time the usable date of the potting mix has expired, you would have transitioned the plant to the next size pot or into the ground. So a plant shouldn't stay in the same pot forever. It should be released. It should be potted up. It should be rejuvenated with fresh potting mix. So hopefully you remember that. A potting mix is not forever and it should be updated periodically. So what else do I need to mention about the potting mix? If you have hanging baskets, I do recommend going to a plastic pot because that will hold a certain amount of moisture within the potting media itself. If you have a wire mesh hanging basket, they dry out way too fast. I've got a lot of hanging baskets at my place and every single one of them is plastic because that means I don't have to water them very often. I know the plants are able to survive easily a week without watering. There is one plant I have to water every 3 days, but that's that particular species. But the rest, extremely low maintenance. Watering, also a deep pot, which has a longer profile of potting media, has the, move my hands out of the way, has a longer capacity, bigger capacity to hold a column of water. Whereas if it's shallow, although it can drain out quick, the funny thing is that because of the profile, it kind of stays moist a little bit longer for surface rooted plants. And the way that they've proven this is they've had sponges standing up and lying horizontal. And they poured the same amount of water in both. And then when they allowed what's called field capacity, the free drainage of the media, to fall out, they then squeezed what was left in the two containers. And the one standing up had less water in it than the one that was lying horizontal. So the idea of growing succulents in a flat horizontal pot may not necessarily be accurate because it holds more water. That could also mean that you don't have to water it as much. So it could be both a pro and a con. So if you do have your succulents in a low pot, don't water it as often because it should be holding water for a longer period. Interesting little bit of science I saw on that, and I'll see if I can track that down one day, and I'll do a replication of it so that you can see what I mean. And of course, place potted plants in a protected situation so that they are not in a wind-blown area, so that they don't have to evaporate as much water. And I think I've covered everything that I wanted to present to you. Obviously, there is more information. There is information you may have that you would like to share with other watchers, and I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. And at that point, I'd just like to say, if you have enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Your comments are really important because you are sharing your knowledge like I'm sharing my knowledge, and I find most gardeners are quite happy to share their knowledge. They're not overly protective of holding and borrowing that knowledge just for themselves. And I think your experience will be different from mine. And where I live, my rainfall isn't too bad. I have had plants that have died because I've lived in so many different suburbs from the outskirts of Ipswich, which were incredibly dry. I remember parts of Brisbane had rain and we had none for months. And then I moved to another area which had really high rainfall, where we had rainfall and other areas didn't get the rainfall. So although Southeast Queensland is regarded as a subtropical area, there is a lot of diversity, a lot of variation in there, in soil type, in rainfall, in wind conditions, in storm, hail conditions, and of course, basically some of the native species in one zone are there and may not be in the other zone. So I encourage you to look at the opportunities available to you when it comes to a water-wise garden. Now remember, we are in the dry season right now. Lots of areas have been declared fire risk. There is a fire ban on right now, so no open fires for any gardeners. Very quickly, I encourage you, if you can, these are the key things to remember as preventative. Clean your gutters, clean debris around the house, remove any logs or anything away from the house to reduce fire burn. Think about selecting plants that have the resilience to tolerate fire. So things that don't burn hot, things that slow burn, or that are succulent, that hold water, that store water, that basically burn. And that could be a combination of natives and non-natives. Remember those key points. And if you're not comfortable getting up on the roof to clear your gutters, get someone in commercially who's insured, because that's very important, getting someone up on the roof to clear those gutters. And that's the end of my video for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. As I said before, I hope you can give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the Subtropical Gardening podcast. So my name is Paul Plant. I'm a qualified horticulturist. I've been a gardening magazine editor on about 5 different radios. I still do 2 radio stations each week, once on a Thursday morning and once on a Saturday morning, in different areas of Southeast Queensland. And I do a lot of presentations in Brisbane libraries and at events. So if I don't see you personally at a function or at an event, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and next week I'll post up another one. But please remember, every single day on YouTube, I do a daily YouTube video on Paul Plant Horticulture for Garden Tips. Hope you will subscribe to them too. For now, thank you very much, and until next week, ciao.
Subtropical Gardening Podcast with Paul Plant.